Well, William Taylor is the former US ambassador to Ukraine and joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador Taylor. Great to speak to you once again. I don't know what you make of the exchange of comments, shall we say, between the Kremlin and the White House these last few days. Russia seems to have had the last word, saying that everyone is feeling emotional at the moment. Are they getting at President Trump, and do you think he's showing signs of being emotional?
I think President Trump is again showing signs of frustration with the Russians. It's not the first time. He has expressed himself about how Putin might be tapping him along, or he's pissed off, was frustrated with the Russians at not accepting his proposals. So this is the latest time that President Trump has expressed this irritation. The real question, Tom, is whether or not this time it's enough for President Trump to actually pull the trigger on some sanctions to indicate that it's more than just words, that he can take some actions to put pressure on Putin to come to the table.
Right, so from going from praising President Putin to calling him, quote, crazy, I mean, you're saying this isn't a sudden shift in rhetoric, it's sort of been a gradual build-up and the result of some pent-up frustration. Is that roughly what you're saying, Ambassador?
That's what I'm saying. It's and a buildup indicates that it's kind of linear. It continues to go up, but it's gone up and down. President Trump has expressed his frustration, and then he has a conversation with President Putin, and he starts talking about economic development. But then Putin again just hammers the Ukrainians with enormous attacks, record attacks on civilian targets and on infrastructure. And President Trump notices, and he gets irritated again. Again, the question for us, the question for this issue is, when does President Trump move from irritation, frustration, anger to actually taking some steps?
Is that what you'd like to see the president do?
Absolutely, absolutely. The only way this is going to stop, and which President Trump rightly wants to happen, the only way this is going to stop is if there's pressure on Putin. If Putin comes to the conclusion, as a result of that pressure, he cannot win. He cannot win on the battlefield. He needs to negotiate. He needs to agree to a ceasefire. The only way that's going to happen is if there's pressure put on him, and that's what needs to happen.
But when we've got language like that being used, you know, President Trump calling President Putin crazy, the Kremlin saying we're talking about emotional overload, quote unquote. I mean, does it suggest that diplomacy is somehow having to give way to personality-driven, unpredictable policy?
Diplomacy is not going forward now, that's clear. And the reason it's not going forward now is also clear. It is Putin. President Trump and President Zelensky 2 months ago agreed on a 30-day comprehensive air, land, and sea ceasefire. President Trump took that to President Putin. President Putin said no. He has said no every time. Not only has said no, he has continued to bombard the Ukrainians. By the way, that's all he can do. He can just fire drones and missiles. Putin is making no progress very little progress on the battlefield. You know, a meter here, a town, a crossroads there. So he's not getting anywhere on the battlefield. The only thing he can do is use these missiles and drones. And so there's no diplomacy until there is pressure put on Putin.
You mentioned that agreement 2 months ago, and yet if we cast our mind back 3 months to that famous Oval Office incident when President Zelensky was more or less shooed out of the White House, I mean, it does look like President Zelensky is now back in the fold, and perhaps that suggests President Trump has had a broader rethink of how he's going to view this entire conflict, and really which side he's going to lend the more support to. I mean, is that how it looks to you?
You know, I think that's right. And after that Oval Office disaster that you just talked about, there was in the Vatican at the funeral this one-on-one, this kind of face-to-face between President Trump and President Zelensky, where they clearly understood each other. And that was, I think, a turning point for this. Again, it has gone up and down from the United States, from the White House, from President Trump. But I do believe that now it is clearer and clearer that President Trump understands that Putin is the problem. Putin is not our friend. Putin is the one holding up this initiative. President Trump, again, has made it his priority to end this war, to end this killing, as he says every time. That's a commendable thing. The problem has been Putin, and I believe that President Trump now understands that Putin is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting interviewing people on this channel. Obviously, we've been covering the Ukraine war, well, in my case, for a number of years, well, since it began. And a few months ago, I mean, talking to people in the Trump administration, it sounded like a lot of their lines to take were very, very much in lockstep with the lines to take that the Kremlin might have given us on the same sort of issues. I don't know if you've seen, whether you noticed that as well, and whether or not you've subsequently seen a shift in that narrative in terms of how people in President Trump's orbit now view this conflict. Do you think there has been a significant shift?
I do think there has been a shift, and you're absolutely right. There are early days of the Trump administration where there were some inexplicable decisions. That is, you will remember, I'm sure you reported, that the United States voted with Russia and North Korea and Belarus in the United Nations. We voted against a resolution that would condemn Russian invasion. And we've supported that every year over and over. And all of a sudden, in January, we flipped, and we supported the Russians instead of the Ukrainians in the UN. That, I think, has changed. As for the reasons that we've talked about, that is this understanding that President Trump and President Zelensky came to in the Vatican. The minerals deal that you referenced turns out now to be a pretty good deal on both sides. It didn't start off that way. There were lots of negotiations to make that better, and I think it is better. And that's an indication as well that the United States is aligned with Ukraine on economics and on the desire to get to a negotiated ceasefire. And again, Putin is not there, but there has been a shift in the direction of supporting the Ukrainians on their desire for a ceasefire.
Right, and by extension, therefore, the Trump administration perhaps coming more around to the European position on this conflict, which hasn't really changed in the last few months. I mean, do you think there are going to be some sighs of relief in the corridors of power in European capitals?
I think European capitals have stepped up, have really recognized that they need to take the lead on the support for Ukraine. That even though there is this shift or perceived shift in the U.S. policy in favor of Ukraine against Russia, recognizing that Russia is the problem, even though we see that the Europeans know that they're going to have to pick up the ball. They're going to have to pick up the burden. They're going to have to provide the weapons and the ammunition and maybe the funds so that the Ukrainians can buy weapons from the Americans. The Europeans are also stepping up their plans to provide a deterrent force. If there is a ceasefire, there have been good discussions. They've dragged out a bit, but nonetheless, the discussions have never happened before on how the Europeans could get together and put a force on the ground in Ukraine to be sure that the Russians don't invade again in the event there's a ceasefire. All to say that, yes, the Europeans have stepped up out of concern that the Americans might not be there. Europeans have stepped up. And with that stepping up, with that European moving forward, I believe that the Trump administration can support that.
And Ambassador Taylor, I'm sure you'll recall as well, I mean, in the early days of the second Trump presidency, it sounded rather as though President Trump was making various concessions to Moscow on behalf of Ukraine and not getting too many in return. I mean, have you noted any concessions that have been made by Moscow during the course of these last 3 or 4 months?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever. They continue to demand essentially the Ukrainian surrender. That's what they're asking for every time. The root causes they talk about, Putin talks about. That's code for, very barely code for Ukrainian surrender. That is, limits on their ability to defend themselves, no going into NATO, no support from the West in terms of military support. So yes, there have been no indications that the Russians are willing to make any compromises, no concessions whatsoever.
Yeah, and it's just interesting trying to reconcile that and trying to reconcile those early concessions made by the Trump administration with one of the latest pieces put out on social media by President Trump. He says, quote, "I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does," warns President Trump, "it will lead to the downfall of Russia." Let's unpack that. Let's start by talking about what does the downfall of Russia mean in this particular context, you think?
So if Putin tries to take all of Ukraine, which again, I believe is his ultimate goal, he wants to dominate Ukraine, eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And if he, as President Trump suggests, if Putin tries to take over Ukraine, occupy all of Ukraine, that's an impossible task. He will fail. Putin will fail. He cannot dominate Ukraine. The Ukrainians will resist. They will continue to fight. And in the end, Russia will fail. When they fail, when Russia fails in its history, the leaders who are responsible for those failures don't last. That may be what President Trump's talking about.
Okay, we're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, I mean, on the one hand, we've got a situation where Russia is sort of talking about negotiations and peace efforts, and there have been direct contacts between Kyiv and Moscow. And on the other hand, they're stepping up the bombing campaign on Kyiv, as they have done in the last couple of days. What should be the American response from a diplomatic point of view to this apparent duplicity on the part of the Russians?
It is duplicitous. You're exactly right. Yes, on the one hand, the Ukrainians and the Russians can deal where there is will to come to an agreement, like on the prisoner exchange, 1,000 prisoners in each direction last weekend. Because the Russians wanted it, the Ukrainians wanted it, it can be done. But when you look at the ceasefire discussions, the ceasefire negotiations, the Ukrainians want it, the Americans want it, the Europeans want it, and the Russians don't. So if the Russians don't want to deal, don't want to negotiate, don't want to make any compromises, don't want to come to the table seriously to talk about a ceasefire, then there's not going to be one. So on the one hand, they've shown through these prisoner of war exchanges that it can be done. The conversation can take place. Agreements can be achieved. But when they don't want, when the Russians do not want the ceasefire, do not want negotiations, it cannot be done.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.